Welcome to the Cyber Sangha podcast. Cyber Sangha is a program of free live broadcasts, launched in 2009 by renowned teacher and author Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche. Join us as we draw on ancient Tibetan wisdom to discover how to connect with our best self and live to our highest potential. The following conversation, Choosing Wisdom, Discovering Joy in Difficult Truths, happened on August 25th, 2023, as a science and spirituality dialogue with Professor of Philosophy Emily McRae, physician and author Margaret Plews-Ogan, Tibetan meditation master Geshe Tenzin Wangyal, and host Alejandro Chaoul. This was part of a year-long series on embracing life with wisdom and compassion. This content is for informational purposes only. Listeners should consult medical professionals for any physical or mental health concerns. Please use headphones and do not meditate while driving or operating machinery.
Welcome everyone to another dialogue in Cyber Sangha. My name is Alejandro Chaoul, and I'll be moderating today's dialogue on science, spirituality, today with the topic of ignorance and wisdom. Choosing wisdom, discovering joy in difficult truth. And of course, we have our teacher, Tenzin Wangyal Rinpoche, the founder of Cyber Sangha. And joining him today, we have two wonderful different kind of doctors, one MD, one Ph.D. And so I'll start with Peggy. Margaret Plews-Ogan is the Bernard and Annie Brody Professor of Medicine at the University of Virginia School of Medicine and the co-director of the Wisdom and Wellbeing Program, which is a health system initiative to address stress, burnout, and professionalism at UVA, which includes a coaching program for faculty and staff. She's also the recipient of a Templeton Foundation grant to study how wisdom is developed through adversity. In that the research, she studied both patients and physicians and the process of moving through difficult circumstances to wisdom gain. She actually wrote the book, Choosing Wisdom, Strategies and Inspirations for Growing Through Life-Changing Difficulties, and also on wisdom leadership, leading positive change and the Academic Health Science Center. So Peggy, welcome to Cyber Sangha. Great to have you. And thank you after, I know, a long night. So thank you for joining us.
It's a privilege to be here.
Great, thank you. Emily, so good to see you. Emily is an associate professor of philosophy at the University of New Mexico. She specializes in Tibetan Buddhist philosophy, ethics, moral psychology, and feminism. Much of her work is in the philosophy of emotions and the philosophy of interpersonal relationships. With the support of a National Endowment of Humanities Award for faculty, she's currently writing a book on Indo-Tibetan philosophical approaches of moral ignorance. Welcome, Emily. Welcome you both. It's so great to have you in Cyber Sangha. So thank you. So as we're telling you, it's informal. And we want to really understand, I mean, both of you have these approaches to your topics, and part of it is how we can, by dialogue, understand better. So let's dive into ignorance first. And Emily, what attracted you to this topic and to this book that you're about to write, or you're in the process of writing?
Well, I've been interested in this topic for several years now, and I think before the pandemic, and I think one of the things that originally interested me was actually collective kinds of ignorance. So the ways that we as a society ignore things, forget things, deny things. Climate crisis is, of course, a big one. And then during the pandemic, I think that reached kind of like a certain fever pitch in American society anyway, with disinformation about the virus and the vaccine. And I was interested in why this happens and why we also find it so compelling. And not easily correctable. Of course, we also see like conspiracy theories are also in that kind of vein of these sort of distorted things distorted ways of viewing the world that we can become really attached to. But I was also interested in a kind of more personal or interpersonal sense as well, which, I got thinking about the ways in which we have kind of our own personal or interpersonal conspiracy theories or distortions about our lives, about our relationships, about other people. And we also can be very committed to those. And so that was sort of just the basic thinking that got me interested in this topic. And being a philosopher, I look to philosophy to see for clarity. And I noticed when I looked to Western philosophers generally, there wasn't actually very much said about what ignorance is. There's a lot said about what knowledge is. And there's kind of an assumption that ignorance is maybe just the lack of knowledge. It's just the absence of knowledge. But that didn't sit very well with me because I think the kind of ignorance and confusion that I was interested in didn't seem like a lack of knowledge. It seemed for a couple of reasons. One, because it seemed a lot more active than that. It seemed like something that we're sort of participating in, not just a passive sort of gap in our knowledge. And it also seemed like if we think about ignorance as just sort of like a gap or absence of knowledge, then it seems to imply that we would correct ignorance by getting knowledge, by acquiring knowledge. But that doesn't always work. I mean, I remember doing some research into conspiracy theories, and a lot of the advice from psychologists was if you're talking to somebody who is in that situation, giving them a lot of counter evidence, a lot of knowledge about why the conspiracy theory isn't true, actually can make things worse because they can either try to explain that away, but also because you might damage your relationship with that person. So then I got interested in other ways of understanding ignorance, and I turned to Buddhist accounts of ignorance, which there are many different types of ways ignorance is talked about in Buddhism. But at the very core, I think ignorance is sort of a central concept in understanding why we suffer and understanding our psychology and how we misunderstand the world. So you see the Buddha, of course, talking about ignorance as part of the 12 links of dependent origination, which is a model for understanding how suffering occurs. We also see ignorance as a klesha, or a dysfunctional state that causes wrong action. So I guess I can talk about this for a long time, but maybe I'll just say I got really interested in a particular Buddhist account by a 4th century Indian philosopher Vasubandhu, who gives a really, I think, helpful account of what ignorance is in this big text, the Abhidharmakosha. And he argues that ignorance isn't an absence of knowledge. And the reason is because ignorance is a cause of suffering. It's not just sort of a passive thing that we don't have. And instead, he suggests that we could think about ignorance as an activity of opposing clear knowledge. It's something that we're doing that blocks or obstructs or hinders our integration of knowledge, of clear knowledge about the Four Noble Truths, for instance, about karma, about the nature of the self. And that really inspired me because I thought, well, that really changes how I was thinking about ignorance, because it sort of changes ignorance from something that you just have or something that you are into something that you're doing. And it also suggests that if we want to work with our ignorance, it's not just about acquiring knowledge, but about changing something that we're doing. So that was sort of my way into the topic and and where I landed.
Great. Fascinating. Thank you. So moving from philosophy to medical sciences, Peggy, how does this kind of understanding ignorance is in your field? Does it make sense, or how would you see it, or how would you see it in your field?
It makes total sense, and it's very exciting, actually, to hear Emily talk about this, because I think it is a way of breaking through, helping people to understand how to break through in situations where people are stuck or are suffering. So I kind of backed into this notion by, a lot of what we do in medicine is observation, close observation of people and their circumstance, and from that, trying to figure out how to help them. And I was interested in closely observing those who seem to be able to move through really challenging circumstances and come out the other end better as people, having learned and changed in a positive way. And we identify these people mostly through their own self-nomination. And then we interviewed them carefully about what was it, what kinds of changes did they go through, what was it that helped them to move through this, and how did they think, what deep things had they learned about themselves or the world. And what's really exciting about what we're talking about today is that it really all started, this process that they moved through really all started with a deep acceptance of, wow, I am in a situation here that A, I cannot change, and B, in order to move through this, I have to deeply accept in some way that this is happening. And that if I'm going to get through this, I need to accept it, first of all. And secondly, I need to move toward it rather than move away from it. So with, and people talked about things that bring to mind curiosity and humility, but this, we called it stepping in, this moving toward, this active moving toward a really challenging circumstance with the intention of, what can I learn from this? How can I change? How am I involved in being able to make the best of this situation? And then integrating that, the kind of third element in this was integrating that new reality. So for physicians, for example, who had made, one of the populations we studied were physicians who had made a serious mistake. This is something that physicians do not like to think about, that's for sure, because it's so devastating to think that we go into a profession to help people and we've perhaps done something that might have harmed someone. So this deep acceptance of, as a physician, despite my intention, it is possible that I could hurt someone. And then moving into it to say, what does that mean about who I am as a doctor and how I understand myself in this world? And how can I be a good doctor and understand that I can make mistakes? How does that change me and how I approach the world? So integrating that new understanding was a part of them. I think, as Emily was suggesting, it's that active part of identifying what's opposing their capacity to change for the better, and how can they lean into that process of positive change.
Wow.
So this is an exciting conversation for me. Thank you for inviting me to talk about this.
Sure. No, thank you, Peggy. This is wonderful. And I like this. It seems that it going from ignorance to acceptance to slowly move towards that challenging situation, and then hopefully some wisdom will arise from that.
Yes,
Rinpoche.
the final kind of, final, all of this is iterative, all of it's circular, as they described this process, there wasn't a linear a process to this at all. It was back and forth and up and down, but eventually both the patients who were struggling with pain and these physicians who were struggling with the mistake reached this new understanding of themselves and a new way of kind of living in the world. And then the final process was actually wanting to better understand it and to share it. So it was this very social process, I guess you would say, this deep recognition that others had helped them and that they wanted to help others now. So the wisdom part of this had very much to do with bringing this forward into the rest of the world with generosity and a deeper connection.
Fascinating. Oh, I love this incorporation of others and the understanding of how we're, I mean, in a way, we never, even though we think, oh, I do this alone, that we never do. And I guess that itself is a kind of wisdom. Rinpoche, do you want to jump in and
first of all, can you hear me okay? Because I'm not okay, good. So first of all, thank you, Peggy, Emily, joining us on our Cyber Sangha. Yeah, so I think maybe I will just say a little bit in Tibetan tradition or Buddhist tradition or Dzogchen tradition. When we think about ignorance in a very simple way, will be really the core part of the ignorance. Idea of ignorance will be lack of understanding of self-realization. Therefore, lack of understanding of the objects, the appearances that you perceive. So basically, perception of whatever you're perceiving, somebody's perceiving. So if you don't know who is perceiving it, more likely you will not know what you're perceiving it also. So that is kind of the fundamental basic idea of ignorance. When you don't understand the truth of yourself or truth of reality, what you're perceiving, then there is a lot of sense of confusion, and the suffering, all suffering starts from there. The idea of, I think, as Emily mentioning, idea of this, how you say, it's not an absence of knowledge. I think in some sense, ignorance itself is not like a, I mean, ignorance itself is, in our tradition, we say, you go toward it, you find the light in the darkness, you find the joy in pain, you find the confidence in fear, you can never, ever run away from something that you wanted to understand. So in order to understand the truth of something, you have to go toward it. And then because what's happening is, because as a pain identity, when you don't know yourself, as a pain identity, you project a lot of things out there, which is not there. The only way to know it's not there is just you're projecting it. It's to go toward it, not go away. The farther you go, easier it is to project more. The closer you go, it's harder to project more. Once you get there, there's nothing to project on. So you see the naked, we call it nakedness of the truth, so you see this is it, this is it, there's nothing there. So in some sense, I think the idea of not renouncing, not running away, going toward it, that you find the light in the darkness. If you run away from the darkness, you can never find the light. So I think, so I think that's a general, I think a basic understanding. I think it seems like when Peggy, when you were mentioning about this idea of acceptance, when it's true that everybody who, I think, some sense in the very difficult moment in life, challenging moment in life, it's always true. I know I can speak for personally, I can speak about it, but I can also know knowing people who go through difficult moments. The moment you accept it, or moment even the idea of I'm willing to accept, you're not able to accept yet. but idea of I'm willing to accept. I'm not going to run away. I'm willing to go forward. I'm willing to accept. I'm willing to do whatever is necessary to do. I'm willing to overcome and go beyond it. So just that little confidence itself, I think it's a very, very powerful tool. And that means I think every challenges, suffering. I think very often that without suffering we will not grow. If you have a good relationship to your suffering, that's really probably the only way to really grow and develop personal and spiritual development. Good relationship to the suffering. The bad relationship to the suffering is you just suffer for you wasted your pain. So pain should become a useful, which means you grow through it. Yeah.
So thank you, Rinpoche. And yeah, I mean, it seems I like, we're all converging towards this, moving towards this aspect of ignorance, that it's not something passive, actually. And so how do we, I guess, choose wisdom? Or how does this process go? And Peggy, your book is on choosing wisdom. Well, I like that. I mean, there's an active component there of that. Do you want to move us into that direction?
Well, so that's a really, really big topic, because and I think what both Rinpoche and Emily were suggesting, it seems to me that one of the big tasks that I'm dedicated to is trying to figure out how to help people who are in that situation of suffering, to kind of recognize that they have choice. They have a choice here, and that it matters whether they choose, one path or the other. But most importantly, because I think Emily's onto something, that what is it that opposes that choice? And how do we help people to discover that and know how then to move forward? It's interesting. One of the other things that I do in my work is I help people to have difficult conversations with each other. So if someone says something that makes the other person angry, how do you help people to have a productive conversation that doesn't destroy the relationship, but that does help them move through a tough circumstance? And I spend a lot of time trying to help people to understand how to understand each other, such that they can now move into this space and have a difficult conversation that they can both grow from, as opposed to sticking into in their various mindsets and staying apart, no one growing, no one changing, and everyone basically either by being angry at one another and suffering individually. One of the things I found really powerful, actually, is pointing out to people that right now in this circumstance, when they're both angry or they're hostile or they're hating one another, they're actually all suffering. Everyone is suffering. And I've noticed people kind of look at me like, no, I'm hating someone, I'm not suffering. That there's this, it's kind of eye-opening to think that I am causing some of my own suffering when I hate someone, or I'm hostile toward them. I wonder what you all think is, what's the key to unlocking this willingness, this acceptance, and this kind of clear-eyed willingness to step into the truth of a situation?
Emily, Rinpoche?
Well, I suppose I could say a few things, and we'll save the best for last. one thing I was thinking about, Peggy, when you were speaking, and then also Rinpoche, what you were saying about turning towards darkness rather than away from it, is how much we're kind of coalescing around this idea of wisdom is about stepping toward, and ignorance is about avoidance, kind of, right? There's a certain avoidance pattern in ignorance, which is just, I guess, sort of interesting to me. It's a sort of metaphor, I guess. It's a orientation metaphor about how, are we avoiding something or are we facing something? And I think there's ways that we could probably tell if we're aware. I mean, I know in my own life, I don't like to admit when I'm avoiding something, but I can kind of tell that, sometimes that there might be some avoidance. So I wonder, one thing that just comes to mind is, thinking about some of the metaphors that get used in Mahayana Buddhism about wisdom. I'm thinking about one, might be from Tsongkhapa, or I don't remember who, but talks about wisdom as one of the, as kind of like a crown jewel in a crown of virtues, other virtues like generosity and patience and meditative concentration. And it seems to me like wisdom is kind of this meta, complex kind of meta skill that, like, just to speak directly to your question, Peggy, about like, what is it that might make us step in or turn toward? It seems like it might not be one thing. It might be a lot of things. It might be empathy. It might be patience. It might be a cultivated sense of equanimity. That's something that I've thought a lot about in my own work, the importance of cultivating what Buddhists call equanimity, this sense of being able to be non-reactive. And I don't know, I don't think that that's equivalent to wisdom, but it might be a big part of wisdom. These other kind of things other moral or cognitive skills, I guess you could say, that kind of go along with wisdom.
Yeah, so I think in Buddhism, generally, I think simple, trying to keep it simple and think simple will be, there's two things, as I mentioned earlier. So there is a very clear sense of what wisdom means. So wisdom means the realization of the truth, and the truth could mean realizing outer world truth, and a more important truth will be realizing yourself, who you are. So core of every suffering is connected with not knowing who you are. And the idea of, Peggy, your question about why we resist to going toward will be its unknown world, because we don't know what we are going toward. We don't know what's going to happen. Everything is very unpredictable. And also a question about who is not going toward. So that who is, you can say, the ignorance, what I call it, pain identity. So when your pain identity is the opposite of the wisdom. Wisdom is realization of who you are, and the pain identity is you always identify with something when you don't know yourself. So whatever you're identifying with, and it's very difficult for anyone to lose it, because that's who you are. For you, that's only who you are. And if you lose it, you lost everything, because you don't know who you are. That's the wisdom. So, and then as Emily is saying, there could be many things to prevent it. Yes, it could be fear, it could be imbalances, it could be anger, it could be 84,000 afflictions. But the core of 84,000 affliction is the only one thing, is lack of self-realization, not knowing who you are. And the active part of the opposite active part of it is identifying with something that who you are not. And that is the core of every problem. I think, that's how we see it in the teaching in Buddhism and Dzogchen. That's how I think it's kind of very there's not much of different interpretation. That's it, so then we can interpret many different things, but that's the core.
Emily, did you want to?
That was good facial reading, Ale. I did want to say, maybe ask Peggy, because I did in your first account of your research, I think you did say something about after the stepping in process, you talked about integrating knowledge or wisdom, and it might involve changing your identity. And then you also mentioned that in terms of when you talked about doctors who make medical errors, that it's the reason that's so scary has a lot to do with identity, right? How you think about yourself. I'm a doctor. I help people. I don't make mistakes. I wondered if you felt, just going off of what Rinpoche said about identifying with something you're not, if you see that coming up in concrete ways in your work on wisdom and ignorance.
Yes, and I think that's partly what was so moving about the process that most of the doctors, in fact, I think almost all the doctors we interviewed, identified with or described this process of having to wrestle with this identity that they were carrying with them of perfection. And it seemed impossible to them at first to drop that identity or to change that identity, to incorporate this notion of imperfection. And part of, I think, when I was hearing both of you talk, I was thinking about how powerful it was for many of the people in this study that others showed compassion for them in particular moments that allowed them to recognize that perhaps, despite the fact that this identity that they had had before wasn't working anymore, right? That someone was showing them compassion, allowed them to kind of move into this, well, maybe I can do this. It was disarming in a way, so that they could maybe drop their weapon and move into the truth that they had been either resisting or afraid of. So, yeah, I'm wondering, having heard both of you talk, if some of the key here is others showing compassion when someone is suffering in this way, that opening up a space that wasn't there before. I don't know if that resonates, but it certainly resonates with me.
Yeah, I think compassion clearly feels like it play a very important role. And earlier, Peggy, you were talking about acceptance. So somehow, when two people are in argument and there's a conflict, somehow the identity of two individuals that are having conflict with each other, but there's some point somewhere they open up a little bit more space from that identity, and they have this notion of acceptance that's a little bit going beyond that identity, and that acceptance then a little bit going beyond that, then there's a little sense of compassion. So compassion and acceptance is somehow a little break out or a little break from the pain identity. I think it happens in the process for everybody, and I think so. Sometime question will be what actually triggers that to able to accept more, or what triggers that able to open our heart to have a little bit more understanding, compassion to each other. So I think it's a very, very good question,
Yeah, and as we know, compassion and wisdom have a lot of correlations, at least in the Buddhist world, I think in others as well. I was interested, Emily, when I was thinking, are you bringing those components in as you're looking into the moral aspects of ignorance.
Bringing in the components of compassion and
Wisdom.
sorry, you cut out for a second, Ale.
Sorry, of compassion and wisdom.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I think that I agree. I mean, I think with what Peggy and Rinpoche were saying, that it's a really important piece of this puzzle. And it makes sense in a Buddhist context. Compassion is a response to suffering. Ignorance is a cause of suffering. So it makes sense if we respond well to someone's suffering, that could open up some space for them to reflect on the cause of that suffering. I mean, that's true in my personal life. I would much rather someone respond to me with compassion when I'm making mistakes, and when, as a mom, too, it works pretty well. If you respond compassionately to a child, they're often able to take a step back and maybe rethink rather than getting defensive. I think fear is a huge driver in all of this. Fear, I mean, Rinpoche talked about the fear of the unknown, going towards something that you don't know what's on the other end of it, who's on the other end of it. No one's on the other end of it. And compassion is, I think, a way that we can deal, the most effective way that we can accept and acknowledge fear as well as suffering. I think fear is really reactive. And so it needs some love, I think, some loving space to not react and, not habitually react. So, I mean, I guess in terms of my work so far on the topic, I haven't really gotten to this part of it, but I want to, which I think, just like wisdom is I think a kind of meta, I don't know, state or something that involves a lot of other kinds of skills. I think ignorance does too. It involves, actually, I mean, Vasubandhu says something like, ignorance is like the king, and all the other kleshas or dysfunctional states are like the king's attendants. So ignorance is always around, when anger is there, ignorance is there. When envy is there, ignorance is there. So yeah, I think there's probably going to have to be a multi-pronged sort of approach to dealing with something like ignorance, and compassion is surely, and love, I think, are surely part of that approach.
Yes. So I think like when we're feeling anger, or when we're feeling fear, or as Emily is talking about the children, when you feel upset with some harsh word they would say to you, or whatever, or anybody would say to you, particularly a child. So I think in these teachings they say you have to see who is feeling it, who is feeling hurt. So somebody is feeling hurt, but you should not identify with that. Somebody is feeling angry, but you're not angry. Somebody is feeling upset, you're not upset. So somehow, whoever is experiencing it, somehow you need to know, or trying to know, that you are not that. You're more than that. You're beyond that. So, and then if you're able to feel a little space, okay, I'm feeling anger, but I'm not anger. So I have a little more choice. I don't have to act only from anger. I can choose not to act. I can choose act later. I can choose act nicer. I can choose act opposite, rather than acting from anger. I can act from love, because I do have a choice of acting from love, even though I'm feeling anger, maybe even physically I'm feeling it, experiencing it, because I'm not that. The idea of not disidentifying with the destructive emotion. So maybe I think that's the word. I think disidentifying with the destructive emotion is because you are realizing you're not that. And even though you don't know who you are, realizing, at least I don't know who I am, but definitely I'm not this one. So I'm not going to do everything what this is telling me to do. So that I think that that way, one opens up to more idea of acceptance and compassion, understanding. Or, I'm angry because I'm afraid losing something. I'm angry because I expect love from you. I'm angry because I'm expecting something better than this from you. So there's some expectation is definitely there, but who is expecting it? It's my expectation, it's not me. So always the process is, I think, always able one way or another way, realizing little or big or whole, that you're not what you identify with. All the responses is coming from what you identify with it, and you're not that. And more you get clue of that, I think the more acceptance will be there, more space for compassion will be there, any other qualities will be there, I think.
And Rinpoche, I'm wondering if that's part of the power of community, that others can sometimes show us a different way of being or responding. And maybe that's what I meant by it can be so disarming. I think sometimes when we get into spaces where there's a lot of anger, hostility, and we're both standing apart, when the other person responds instead with compassion, it gives us a different example than we're expecting. It gives us something that helps us to understand how we might have a different identity in this conversation. And I know that the patients and physicians often in their journeys, they found someone who was a beacon like that, who could show them a different way of being, that you could be, for example, an imperfect but good doctor. Kind of showed them that new identity. Do you think that's?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the very practical exercises that we teach, we say, no matter what your emotion you're feeling, we take 3 pills, I call it 3 precious pills, trying to be still, be aware of the stillness in your body. So you don't have to, whatever you're feeling, it doesn't matter. You don't have to respond physically right away, or take a precious pill of silence. So we try to be aware of inner silence, just feeling silence. That means we don't have to respond right away from that pain. Third pill, we say, trying to be aware of spaciousness in your heart, in your mind. So that there's some sense of openness there when you draw attention inward. Just being aware of this stillness in your body, silence in your speech, spaciousness in your heart, and feeling a little bit, even like 30 seconds, your response will be completely different. And not only your response will be completely different, the response from other people will be completely different toward you, because you're giving them the space. You're giving them a moment of silence. I mean, there's supposed to be one very artificial intelligence, American Express, that in Miami somewhere, 300 people collecting money from American Express company, and they listen to everybody's conversation. There was one person was most successful for millions of dollars she was able to collect, and then she said, see what she was doing special, So and they listened to our conversation. She was not saying anything different than everybody else saying, or what everybody else told to what how they should be talking. But the only difference is what she was paused. There was a silence in her when she communicated with people. So this millions making dollar of silence. Of course, they are trying to make everybody silent now. But what I'm trying to say here is that, just giving that space to someone, I think that opens up a lot. And the compassion is clearly somebody's feeling space before you did, and they're giving you some space.
That's beautiful.
Yeah, and I think that space also brings that think that, Peggy, you were talking the choice. You have that opportunity of choosing, right? Because you have that moment of pause, and as Rinpoche says, of taking the 3 pills. And then from there, there's a moment of opportunity of choosing, and hopefully choosing wisdom, right? Do you see some of that in the interviews that you've experienced for your book?
Absolutely. In fact, like Rinpoche was suggesting, of course, we do it in a kind of more medical way, I guess you would say, but we are now helping or teaching residents and medical students about taking a pause. So an actual practice that they can put in place the same way they wash their hands every time they see a patient. While they're washing their hands, they're taking a moment, they're taking a breath, they're centering, they're leaving behind the patient they just saw, and they're preparing to see the patient that they're about to go see. So helping them to develop this practice so that when they do have an encounter that is challenging in some way, that perhaps they have a better platform, a better practice to be able to fall back on. And one of the things that physicians commented on, and the patients for sure, was that when things got really tough and they were in that moment of, this terrible thing has just happened, how am I going to respond? Having that to fall back on, that practice to fall back on, was very helpful, because in the moment, with the emotions being high, it's a tough space. So having something like that there's a routine for them, was really helpful.
Yeah, I love that. We in the hospital we use the same technique. As a good friend of mine and Rinpoche's too, Jim Duffy, would say that every patient's room has a meditation device, and that's the gel. And as then you take a moment and you kind of clear everything else, and now you're there 100% with the patient. So yeah, beautiful. Yeah. Okay. Anything else that anyone feels drawn to say a little more about?
A question, actually. I'm wondering what all of you think about this. It takes us maybe a little bit off of some, off of this conversation a touch, but I was thinking about, so far we've talked about how do we do this when adversity strikes, in times of suffering. How do people turn towards that and move through that rather than avoid it and turn away? But I'm kind of wondering, which is of course really, really important to question, but I'm also curious about how we could do that when we're not suffering in that way. And I'm thinking about that because of things like climate crisis, where maybe a lot of us aren't feeling in our country and in our, maybe not, maybe you're involved in wildfires and whatnot, but there's still many of us probably who are not feeling that in a life-changing, rip you open kind of way, right? It's a little abstract, it's a little bit, it's some suffering, but not a lot of suffering. I wonder, what are the approaches for developing wisdom when we're not forced to, right? When we're not kind of put in a position where it's like you can do it or you cannot do it. We can kind of continue to avoid. I've often kind of wondered about that, because from a Buddhist point of view, I guess you could say one of the things that was interesting to me about ignorance, as opposed to say something like anger, which has a really like a a felt sense in the body. Like when we're angry, there's certain things we can feel in our body that would tell us that we're angry. Certain kinds of thoughts we might have. And same with hatred or even envy or jealousy. But ignorance can feel a lot of different ways. It could hurt, or it could feel, you could be very confident and very clueless, and you might feel really just fine. There's no kind of red flag that says, oh, this is causing my suffering. So I wonder what you all think about how you develop wisdom in those sorts of situations.
So Emily, you're saying basically when we are bliss out in our ignorance.
Yeah. Right.
Blissful ignorance, right?
That's right. Yeah.
I think, eventually the adversary or eventually the suffering will come. I don't think we'll be too long in that blissful state. So I don't think we need to worry in some sense. I guess it's there. But on the other hand, I do believe that somehow, ignorance and these emotions in our, we call it the samsaric world, they play a very important role, I think. They really, really play. I mean, more and more, I feel like that, problem is we are human. If we are enlightened beings in a Buddhism, Buddhas, then it will not be a problem. We are human beings, so we will always find a problem. Because no matter what way, we are good at it. So we can live in ignorance, blissful ignorance for some period of time, then there will come, time will come, we will suffer. Because culturally, if you think about nowadays, people talk about, when we are growing up, we were hungry all the time in a monastery. We were growing up, we were hungry all the time. As a teenager, never felt like I had enough food, So we, nowadays, people are talking about, in the medical, people are talking about fasting is good for longevity, exposure to the cold, 11 minutes a week, it's a good thing. So basically saying physiologically exposed to the suffering is a good, because that's how you build your defense system. That's how you become alive, you awaken. And I think the same thing mentally, same thing. This is what the stuff. But the only thing I think the problem is when we think we have to run away from our suffering, and that's a fundamental problem. The moment you think about it's not about running away from the suffering, even though we don't like it, we don't want to have it. Once you have it, running away is not a solution. At least getting that good idea of that, I think, will help a lot. And so I think basically I'm not answering your question directly, but maybe I'm saying it's probably, sooner or later it'll come. It won't be very long on a blissful ignorance.
It will catch up with you.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
It's hard to add anything to that, but the only thing I would say is I think that curiosity is a key kind of virtue to instill in others, in ourselves, not in others, but maybe in others. But that curiosity of what's it like to be you? What did this situation have to do with me? We actually know that there's a way of processing everyday experience that leads to wisdom, and then there's a way of processing that leads to adaptation. Adaptation just being kind of the status quo. We adapt, but we don't really change. And curiosity and this kind of what does this have to do with me is a big part of wisdom-based exploration. So I don't know, instilling in our kids, in everyone we meet, that curiosity about the world and what's it like to be you, and what might this have to do with me, and how might I be responding in a better way? That kind of constant striving to be a better person.
Yeah, it brings us back to as well to compassion, right? Because even if my blissful ignorance hasn't caught up with me yet, it might have caught up to you, right? It might have made you suffer, right? So as I'm curious about your experience and cultivating a compassion for your experience, that might be an indirect way in as well. Yeah.
So, for example, like any conflict, when people cannot resolve their conflict, or it could be between siblings, could be children and parents, could be any relationship. So when people are stuck in a conflict, what they're stuck in a two different identity. If they're not stuck with these two different roles and identity, if they really feel the person, then they might be able to go beyond that. Like any situation where you feel like, oh, I wish you do better. I wish expectations, right? So some sense, for example, I mean, as a being father, I can clearly say, you want your child to be free and this and that. But at the end of the day, you still do your homework. You still get your grade well. You need to finish this. And, I love you. You're free, but still, so somehow, but it's how much at some point it depends on how much you have to pay for. You cannot, I mean, in the end of the day, your connection to someone that you love matters the most than any outcome expectation, job, marriage, college, whatever. None of this matter. You just want this person to be happy. And that's all what you care, because the connection matters. You don't want to lose your connection to this being. And you don't want to lose this love, respect to this being, and your expectation about this other person, this and that. They all are just expectation of you want them to be somebody different than who they are, and maybe you are not the one who can love is not loving the person, but the one who is expecting is that identity is getting stronger and stronger, and that you will never able to talk with that person anymore in your life. That's it. End of the relationship. That's how many people end up, because they're getting really stuck in one single identity. And if they cannot question that identity, it's a problem, especially within themselves.
Wow. I think what a great, all these different insights. And I love that curiosity and how that will open. And again, Rinpoche bringing, and Emily too, about, the relationship as parents and children. I think this is crucial. So as we are wrapping up, any last things for this dialogue, or that you want to let the audience know? Whoever wants to start.
I just wanted to thank Peggy and Emily. So I think it was a wonderful conversation. And I appreciate taking your precious time to join us.
Agreed on that.
Well, I want to say thank you for having me. This is wonderful. What an opportunity. Very grateful and so hopeful when I have a conversation like this for the world. Climate change and all, we can do this.
Thank you, Peggy, and hopefully we'll get to see you in person, since our main Ligmincha Center is actually very close to UVA.
Yes, please, Peggy, you're close. Anytime you wanted to come down for lunch, tea, just hang around there. Welcome. Just let us know. Always welcome.
Wow, what an invitation. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
And Emily, for you too, if you fly into Virginia. And hopefully I'll keep in touch with you both and let you know about events that might be more interesting as well. And we'll keep in touch. And thank you again. I want to also thank the team that we don't see, Milos and Poli and so many others that are and Mariela, helping the Cyber Sangha actually be out as they see us. So thank you Rinpoche again. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you, Emily. And thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
And thank you, Ale, for organizing this. And
thank you, Ale, for being so patient and kind and open. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, Rinpoche. Thank you, Peggy. It's been wonderful.
Thank you for listening to the Cyber Sangha podcast. If you'd like to learn more about Cyber Sangha, visit us online at cybersangha.net.